Velkommen and welcome to Tórshavn, the capital of the Faroe Islands. By far the largest settlement on this windswept North Atlantic archipelago, Tórshavn boasts a wealth of riveting Faroese heritage in a variety of enchanting settings. From the cobbled lanes of Tinganes, the ancient peninsula where the Vikings established their parliament 1200 years ago, to the historic fortress of Skansin, which has guarded the Faroese capital here against pirates and foreign navies for more than 400 years. And as well as these most famous landmarks, on our walk around Tórshavn today, we'll admire the dazzling array of public artworks to be found on the town's streets, we'll pass by delightful harbour scenery, and weave our way between historic turf-roofed houses, still lived in by locals. On the way, learning all about the illustrious history of Tórshavn and the Faroe Islands. All of that is to come over the next half hour or so, as we take an in-depth tour of the Faroese capital. But our walk begins with a picture postcard view over Vestararvág, the West Harbour, and the main harbour in Tórshavn. Lined by a colourful row of buildings, former warehouses that now host some of this town's most popular restaurants and cafes, the harbour here provides a perfect introduction to the Faroese capital, and its long association with the sea. Situated in the North Atlantic Ocean, about 450 kilometres, or just under 300 miles southeast of Iceland, and 320 kilometres, or 200 miles northwest of mainland Scotland, the Faroe Islands have for long sat at the heart of important sea trade routes in this part of the world. And for a number of years it was only through the harbour, here at Tórshavn, that overseas trade was allowed to pass in or out of the Faroe Islands. Trade was crucial to the rise of Tórshavn as the Faroes' capital, so much so in fact that just here by the harbour there stands a striking sculpture dedicated to an 18th century trader, a national hero no less, by the name of Nólsoyar Páll. Born in 1766, Nólsoyar Páll was a major figure in developing trade between the Faroe Islands and the rest of Europe, fostering direct links not just with fellow Nordic harbours in Iceland, Norway, Sweden and Denmark, but also in Great Britain and further beyond. In the process, Páll laid the groundwork for the rise of the Faroe Islands on the international stage, introducing new boat-building technologies, developing deep-sea fishing, and kick-starting international trade, helping to transform these islands from what were once a feudal outpost into an ever-growing industrial society. But to really understand the significance of these changes, we need to know the overarching narrative of Faroese history, a story that began some 1200 years ago when Viking settlers arrived on these islands from Scandinavia. Around the time of the 8th and 9th centuries, many poorer farming families living in Norway began leaving their homes in search of a new land, and after setting out to sea, many chanced upon these islands in the middle of the ocean. These Norse settlers laid down roots on the Faroe Islands and used the land here for farming, in the process establishing a Viking society that would grow into the nation we know today. However, as we pass by the beautiful tower of Tórshavn Cathedral, which we'll get a closer look at in a second, the truth is that the Vikings weren't actually the first people to live on these islands. In fact, it's generally believed that they were preceded by small communities of Gaelic monks, who came here from Ireland and Britain a few hundred years before, seeking a life of seclusion far from their homelands. Whether they were forcibly removed from these islands by the pagan Norsemen, or left of their own accord, we don't know. But the role of religion here can't be understated, and just here we find one of the oldest religious sites to be found in all of the Faroe Islands. This is Tórshavn Cathedral, the second oldest active church in Faroe. Originally founded more than 400 years ago in 1609, this eye-catching place of worship stands in a prominent position right at the heart of the Faroese capital. Although the wooden building that we see today is actually a slightly younger rebuild of the original church, constructed around 250 years ago in the 1780s. Now today you'll see churches just like this dotted all over the Faroe Islands, Christianity having been the main religion practiced here ever since the year 1000 AD. But before then, the early Viking settlers weren't Christian at all. They were rather followers of traditional Norse religion. And while the church today plays a much more prominent role in Faroese society, there are plenty of traces of the historic pagan faith brought here by the first settlers to be found. One clear example being the name of the very place that we're exploring now. In English, Tórshavn simply means Thor's harbour, named for Thor, the legendary Norse god of thunder. For short, many people actually refer to Tórshavn simply as Havn, the harbour, this being the place where almost all goods flowed in and out of the Faroe Islands for centuries, and also the place from which the islands were governed. Just now we've strayed off Tórshavn's main streets and into the oldest part of the capital, a small cluster of lanes and distinctive turf-roofed houses that can trace their origins all the way back to the earliest settlers. This neighbourhood is called Reyn, and despite its almost magical old-world appearance, it's a neighbourhood just like any other in the Faroese capital. Although some of the turf-roofed wooden houses around us were built as long ago as the 14th century, they're still lived in by locals, and their traditional construction still serves the purpose of providing good natural insulation from the often cold and rainy weather that you'll find on these North Atlantic islands. As we can see today, at the height of summer, there are still plenty of sunny days to be enjoyed. But this historic part of Tórshavn gives us an excellent window into the past, and how people lived here long before this became the modern capital we know now. Today, the capital of Tórshavn is home to a population of just under 15,000 people, nearly a third of Faroe's entire population. But once upon a time, the settlement didn't spread much further than this old neighbourhood. Because 1200 years ago, it was on this small rocky headland that the Vikings established their very first parliament in the Faroe Islands. The year 825 AD is often cited for this momentous event in Faroese history. And as we make our way out of the neighbourhood of Reyn, we're heading towards a part of the capital called Tinganes, Parliament Point, which is the home of one of the oldest parliaments in the entire world. After early settlers established a society on these islands, there grew the need for a parliament to create laws to govern this society. So it was decided that an assembly, where laws could be created, would be held in a notable place, which could be easily reached by people coming from all directions, whether overland from the farmlands of the Faroes, or overseas from as far away as Norway. They settled on this small peninsula, which sticks out into the natural haven where Tórshavn exists today. And so they established the Løgting, the law thing. Very simply, the Parliament of the Faroe Islands. 1200 years later, the Løgting is still in existence, and just in front of us here are some of the main buildings of the modern Faroese government. This red house, for instance, is the home of the Ministry of Finance. That's right, despite also keeping with the old world appearance of this historic neighbourhood, this small cluster of turf-roofed buildings is home to some of the most important institutions in the Faroe Islands today, with the Ministry of Finance neighboured by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and just up ahead on the right, the Prime Minister's office. Now, the buildings in which the institutions are housed are also among the oldest in Tórshavn, many built in the 17th and 18th centuries. And as we stroll past the Prime Minister's front door just here, these are without doubt some of the most picturesque government buildings that you'll find in the whole world, situated in a place of great importance to the Faroese people. It was on the stones beneath us that those very first Viking assemblies took place more than a millennium ago. And although the modern-day Løgting has now moved a short distance further inland, this spot in Tórshavn is still at the centre of life in the Faroe Islands. Inevitably, this wonderfully scenic part of the capital is very popular with tourists, many of whom may be surprised to bump into government ministers, or even the Prime Minister himself, as they stroll down these historic streets. With a small population and a reputation as one of the world's safest countries, there's little need for White House-level security here in the Faroe Islands, leaving the historic surroundings of Tinganes open for all to explore. And in fact, if we head past the government buildings, we can actually make our way to the very tip of Parliament Point, which still bears plenty of reminders of those earliest assemblies. The Prime Minister's office looks out over the end of this small peninsula, which is marked by a flagpole, from which there flies the flag of the Faroe Islands. A Nordic cross of white, blue and red, the Faroese flag is an unmistakable symbol of this fiercely proud nation. Known locally as Merkið, or the banner, the flag was first raised on these islands back in 1919, interestingly during a small village wedding, and it was later officially recognised on the 25th of April 1940, a day which is still celebrated in the Faroe Islands as Flag Day. Fittingly, the flag flies here at the point where the nation was born. But if we look down at the rocks on which the early Løgting met, we can see a carving that's believed to be an original Viking sundial, which was carved by Norsemen possibly more than 1,000 years ago, and which is remarkably still visible here. Like the nation's flag, this sundial is another symbol of the Faroese identity, which has been forged through the ups and downs of history, but which you might not be all too familiar with on the international stage. That's because while the Faroe Islands has its own flag, its own government, its own language, and much more, this nation is not fully independent. In fact, the Faroes are actually an autonomous territory that forms part of the Kingdom of Denmark. At present, officials in Copenhagen, some 1,300 kilometres or 800 miles away from here, are responsible for defence and some foreign relations for the Faroe Islands, as well as for the much larger but similarly populated territory of Greenland to the northwest. Much like Greenland, though, the Faroe Islands have an entirely distinct identity from Denmark. The native Faroese language, for instance, is much more closely related to Icelandic than it is to Danish. Danish is taught in schools, but you won't generally see it on the streets of Tórshavn, or anywhere else for that matter. You'll hardly see the Danish flag here either, and the local currency is a special Faroese version of the Danish krone. All of this is to say that, despite officially forming part of the Danish realm, the Faroese people are hugely proud of their own national identity, and rightly so, because their story is a fascinating one, which we'll discuss in more detail a little later on. However, having made our way away from the tip of Tinganes, we've been walking alongside the pleasant waters of Eystararvág, the East Harbour, the smaller companion to the Vestararvág where we started our walk. But let's head back into the charming streets of Reyn, the oldest neighbourhood in town, because there's plenty more for us to discover as we continue our tour of Tórshavn. Returning to these historic streets, let's consider exactly how Tórshavn grew from a parliamentary meeting place into the sprawling urban capital that we know today. As we mentioned, for many centuries the settlement here at Tórshavn didn't extend far from the small peninsula that we're walking around now. In fact, this area, composed of Tinganes and Reyn, simply existed on the edge of farmlands, and it had little significance other than hosting those Viking assemblies. However, a couple of centuries after the first meeting of the Løgting, the Faroe Islands were becoming ever more closely incorporated into the Nordic world, which at the time was dominated by the Norwegian realm. In the year 1035 AD, these islands officially became part of the Kingdom of Norway, and they were one of a number of territories ruled by the Norwegian king, also including the nearby Shetland and Orkney Islands, parts of mainland Scotland and the Hebrides, the Isle of Man, the Isle of Anglesey in Wales, and further north, the likes of Greenland, and of course, Iceland. Culturally and historically, the Faroe Islands share much in common with Iceland, and that's why here in the heart of Tórshavn you'll find this building, the Consulate General of the Republic of Iceland. Meanwhile, over in Reykjavik, the Icelandic capital, there's also an official Faroese representation, one of just 7 diplomatic missions of the Faroe Islands abroad. Both tracing their origins back to Norse settlers more than 1,000 years ago, both Iceland and the Faroe Islands began as havens for farming. But as the Norwegian realm, spreading far across the North Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, grew ever more powerful, cross-sea trade soon became a major factor in the lives of territories like the Faroes. Tórshavn, on the Faroes' eastern coast, handily faces towards Norway, specifically towards the city of Bergen. And it was with Bergen that Tórshavn entered into an exclusive trading arrangement in the 13th century. A royal trade monopoly, where ships would bring raw materials from Norway to the Faroe Islands, and where all goods were offloaded here in Thor's Harbour. Through this trade agreement, Tórshavn became the place in the Faroe Islands with the most contact with the outside world. And having already been the home of the Løgting since its inception, Tórshavn was the natural place for Norwegian and later Danish authorities to establish themselves. In short, making this place the capital of the Faroe Islands. But despite this lofty status, Tórshavn was still exceedingly small by modern standards. As recently as 400 years ago, when the cathedral was established, there were few more than 100 people living here. A far cry from the nearly 15,000 that call Tórshavn home today. We'll pick up the story of how the population skyrocketed so dramatically a little later on. But we've now made our way off the peninsula in the heart of the capital, and onto some of Tórshavn's more modern streets, with one of the most important local landmarks standing just in front of us here. This white house is the modern-day Løgting, the Faroe Islands' national parliament. It was built back in 1856, and today it's the place where the Faroe Islands' 33 members of parliament meet to debate and make the laws that govern this autonomous territory. On the green outside the Parliament House, meanwhile, is a bust of a man named Rasmus Effersø, a poet who was born in 1857, and a man who is regarded as one of the fathers of the Faroese independence movement. Although not a fully independent country today, the story of the Faroese push for independence stretches far back in history. As we take a glance at the trickling waters of Havnará, the main stream which flows through Tórshavn, events in Scandinavia began to change the fortunes of these windswept islands, because royal power was shifting away from Oslo in Norway towards Copenhagen in Denmark. In the mid-16th century, the Union of Denmark-Norway was created, with the Danes holding much of the power. And so Danish rule came to the Faroes at a time when trade with these islands was growing ever more important. While raw materials were brought in from Scandinavia to support those living in the Faroe Islands, many goods were also exported from the port at Tórshavn here to be sold overseas. Faroese wool and fish were the main tenets of the economy, and as a layover from the arrangement with Norway, the Danes now held control over the trade monopoly, wherein all products being sold from the Faroe Islands had to be traded with the Danish government or Danish-nominated merchants. For a long time, the Danes used direct and sometimes harsh rule to keep their trading monopoly in shape, and they later incorporated the Faroes, as well as Iceland and Greenland, into Denmark proper, even attempting to discourage the use of the local Faroese language. However, we know today that the Faroese language and identity is proudly on display wherever you look. Just here, for example, is Ráðdhúsið, or the City Hall, which bears a carving of Tórshavn's own coat of arms, featuring the mighty hammer of Thor being held above the waves of the harbour, through which all that trade with Denmark flowed in and out. But despite the Danes' efforts over multiple centuries, they couldn't sustain the trading monopoly. In many cases, it was too expensive and merchants were operating at a loss. So in 1856, it was finally abolished. This all took place at a crucial turning point in Faroese history. We know, for example, that the modern-day Løgting building opened its doors in 1856, while Tórshavn City Hall here followed in 1894, although it was originally designed as a local school, before later taking on its current role. But having been directly incorporated into Denmark in 1814, and having seen the government attempt to suppress the Faroese language and identity, this seemed to only stoke the fires of the people living here. The Løgting, which was actually abolished in 1814, returned soon after in 1852, thanks to a local campaign. And when the trade monopoly was removed in 1856, the people living in these islands were finally able to sell their goods to whomever they chose. And that proved to be a very wide audience. With the Industrial Revolution at its peak in Europe, traditional Faroese agriculture and fishing began to benefit from advancements in technology. The heroic trader Nólsoyar helped to introduce new techniques for deep-sea fishing, and soon enough this grew to a large enough scale that it dominated the Faroese export market. The waters of the Atlantic Ocean here, rich in stocks of salmon, herring and more, which would feed locals, but also growing populations in the industrial cities of mainland Europe. Free trade transformed Tórshavn's fortunes. While only a few hundred people were living here in the early 19th century, hundreds more had moved in by its end. This harbour town occupying a vital position at the heart of the Faroese economy, and in the future of the Faroese push for greater autonomy. As we saw at Tinganes, the Faroe Islands today do have a high degree of autonomy and self-government, and the local language and identity are visible in all walks of life. But as we pass by the Hotel Havnará, which is actually one of the tallest buildings in the Faroe Islands today, it points us towards an important part of life here in the 21st century. Whilst fishing still very much makes up the core of the Faroese economy, and agriculture too remains visible all over the islands, in the last couple of decades, tourism here has become ever more popular. The capital of Tórshavn is often the main place where you'll see tourists, many of whom may be exploring the streets on an excursion from a cruise ship, and many of whom will be staying here for a longer period. With views like this, of distinctive turf-roofed houses in the middle of a busy urban environment, a walk around Tórshavn alone is an absolute delight, and well worth it if you are stopping by on a boat. But there is so much more to the Faroes beyond their riveting capital here. These islands home to unspoilt nature, and arguably some of the most beautiful natural scenery in all of Europe. What's more is that the islands, with a good interconnected road network, are small enough that you can stay here in Tórshavn, spend the day out sightseeing even in the most remote places, and then return here in time for tea. Many of the historic buildings here on the narrow cobbles of Gongin, today home to restaurants and bars which are popular with visitors. Now, this tiny lane is one of the most beautiful you'll find in the whole of the Faroese capital. But once upon a time, it formed part of the main street in Tórshavn, leading from this point, historically close to the outskirts of the settlement, through the neighbourhoods of Undir Ryggi and Reyn, towards Parliament Point. As Tórshavn grew in size over the last couple of centuries, and as people eventually began using cars to get around, the narrowest cobbled lanes of course fell out of use as main roads. But many, as we've seen, have thankfully been preserved to this day. Indeed, while Tórshavn boasts plenty of strikingly modern Nordic landmarks, particularly on the outskirts of town, the presence of such rich history in the heart of the capital here makes it a real joy. And that's not just limited to the land. Just here, floating on the waters of the East Harbour, we find 3 traditional Faroese clinker boats, the kind of boats which served as the lifeblood of this nation for centuries. As a collection of 18 separate islands in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, the people who've lived here have long relied on boats as a core form of transport, and clinker boats, based on the traditional Viking longboats that brought the first settlers here, are actually still made by hand in the Faroe Islands, not unlike the way they were more than 1,000 years ago. Of course, people today make use of modern ferries to travel between the islands by sea. Although, thanks to some rather impressive tunnelling projects over the last few decades, 7 of the Faroes' 18 main islands are actually directly accessible by road from Tórshavn here, putting the awesome and once impenetrable wilderness within easy reach of the capital for all. As we mentioned, getting out into the Faroese countryside to enjoy that scenery is an absolute must if you visit these islands. But even if you only have time to stay in Tórshavn, then there are still plenty of beautiful spots to enjoy. Just here, for instance, we find another historic cobbled lane, which climbs steeply up the hill, in between yet more gorgeous turf-roofed houses. Much like in the old neighbourhoods of Reyn and around Tinganes, this centuries-old street, with its traditional houses, is like any other, with washing lines and pushchairs parked outside the wooden homes. Now, we know that Old Tórshavn was far from the biggest place, but there would likely be more historic houses to be found along the shore here today if it hadn't been for a devastating fire that swept through the settlement back in 1673. The fire ripped through the 17th century town and destroyed all but a few buildings on Tinganes and in Reyn, although, as we've seen, many were quickly rebuilt, restoring that image of Old Tórshavn, the Faroese capital which crowds around its harbour. Of course, the harbour here has been the central feature of this place ever since the first people set foot in Tórshavn. And while it was trade between the Faroe Islands and Norway and Denmark that mostly passed through here, since the beginning of free trade, the harbour has seen plenty more visitors. In terms of commerce, traders from all over Europe have sailed their way into Tórshavn's harbour. And in terms of tourism, modern-day cruise ships and inter-island ferries dock here at the East Harbour. But back in the Second World War, the waters here greeted a foreign navy, which actually occupied the Faroe Islands in 1940. Yes, as tranquil as it may seem, and as distant as it may have been from the theatre of conflict in mainland Europe, even the Faroe Islands were affected in the Second World War. In April of 1940, Nazi Germany occupied Denmark and launched an invasion of Norway, in an effort to prevent Scandinavia being invaded by Britain and France in the early stages of the war. This gave the Germans a dominant position in Europe's northern reaches, and it was feared that the Faroe Islands and Iceland were next in their sights. So, to prevent Germany gaining any further advantage in the region, the British launched their own occupation of the Faroe Islands. Just days after Denmark had been occupied, a Royal Navy fleet set out from the Orkney Islands, and after a couple of days of sailing, it arrived into the harbour here at Tórshavn. Now, this was an extraordinary moment in Faroese history. A foreign navy arriving into the capital, preparing an occupation, led to some panic among the locals, and an emergency meeting of the Løgting was called the very afternoon that British ships arrived. In the event, some members tried to use the situation as an opportunity to declare full independence from Denmark, although a majority in Parliament voted this quick move down. But because the Faroe Islands were officially part of Denmark, the British commanders who arrived first went to the local representatives of the Danish government to agree the terms of the occupation. Even more bizarrely, given that Denmark itself had been occupied by Nazi Germany, the Danish officials here in Tórshavn said that they couldn't technically represent the Danish government. But nevertheless, they agreed to allow the British to occupy the Faroe Islands, provided that they wouldn't interfere in the island's internal affairs. As we pass by Tórshavn's main ferry port, this was met with some dismay by Faroese people, who felt that the British and Danish had gone over their heads in simply allowing the occupation of their homeland. But ultimately, all sides sought to work amicably together for the rest of the war, and the occupation was completed with no violence. So, British troops were stationed here for the duration of the Second World War, and in Tórshavn they established a military base on top of this rocky outcrop, which we find on the edge of the East Harbour, the site of a historic fort that's been used to defend the capital here for more than 400 years. Now, with this fort as a base, the British were highly visible on the streets of Tórshavn, but they were also present more widely across the Faroe Islands. In fact, the British were responsible for constructing a large airfield, which today has become the site of the Faroe Islands' one and only international airport, on the island of Vágar to the west of here. But let's head in to take a look at the historic fort which they used as their base here in the Faroese capital, an important landmark which is known simply as Skansin. Now, as we mentioned, Skansin is one of the oldest structures you'll find in all of Tórshavn. Originally built back in the year 1580, when few more than 100 people lived here, the fort was the brainchild of a local trader by the name of Magnus Heinason, to protect this burgeoning port town against pirates. Once upon a time, pirate attacks were a real problem for the Faroe Islands. Isolated in the heart of the North Atlantic and barely defended in any way, this place often provided easy pickings for pirates, who wouldn't just steal goods, but even kidnap locals, and they'd take them off to the Barbary coast in North Africa to be used as slaves. As we take in a sweeping view of Tórshavn from the rocks of Skansin, this fort was built by Magnus Heinason after he was nearly caught up in a pirate raid himself, and was compelled to safeguard the people living here. Now, back then, this was a very rudimentary fort, but over time, as Tórshavn grew in size and in importance, so did its fort here. And in the 1780s, the Danes beefed up the defences in the first of a series of rebuilds that eventually led to Skansin taking the form we see today. If we turn left just here then, we can venture into the nucleus of the fort, where locals would have kept watch over the sea, readying for any attack. Indeed, the presence of this fort was one of the reasons that more people began moving to Tórshavn, taking up jobs manning these defences, which, as we know, were later co-opted by the British during the Second World War. Now today, Skansin's most recognisable feature is this lighthouse, a modest structure which for decades safely guided ships into Tórshavn's harbour. Of course, the threat of pirate attacks is now long gone, but even today you'll find some centuries-old relics here. This row of small cannons, for instance, originally placed here by the Danes during their rebuilds of the fort, pointing out towards the open sea. Now, during that period, a permanent garrison of Danish soldiers was stationed here at Skansin, as many as 40 men who used the stone building just here, which was then converted by the British into the Royal Navy's headquarters in the Faroes during the Second World War. But as fascinating as all this history is, the main attraction of a visit to Skansin here is the surrounding scenery. This perfect vantage point on the edge of the Faroese capital, offering some stunning views in all directions. Just here, we can look out over the water towards the island of Nólsoyar, just under 3 miles or 4.5 kilometres away. Home to just over 200 people, it's a very tranquil place, also notable as the least mountainous of all the Faroe Islands, that despite the major peak of Eggjarklettur, which we can see right here. Meanwhile, if we turn our attention to the foreground, we can see 2 more cannons. These came from the British ship HMS Furious, and they were placed here at Skansin Fort during the Second World War. So, with beautiful views and rich history, Skansin has it all. And that makes this a fitting place to mark the end of our walk around the endlessly enchanting Faroese capital of Tórshavn. Home to a wealth of riveting heritage, charming streets and so much more, this is a wonderful place to explore. But of course, it's not all that the Faroe Islands have to offer. This stunning windswept archipelago boasting some of the most exceptional scenery in all of Europe. From towering waterfalls to mesmerising lakes, gorgeous villages, immense mountains, and everything in between. With that in mind, I'd like to say thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you are now looking forward to planning your own trip to Tórshavn and the amazing Faroe Islands sometime soon.